In Chapter 4, we explore how supply and demand determine prices. And the core of this is going to be, again, the concept of equilibrium that we mentioned in Chapter 3. And sometimes we use the word market clearing rather than equilibrium. And so if I use one or the other, they mean the same thing for our purposes here. The first thing we want to explore is how do markets adjust to change? Okay, so we can start by sort of making sure we understand what we mean by equilibrium. Equilibrium simply means a situation in which, in general, means a situation in which there are no forces acting upon an object to change, right? So in the context of economics, this means the price at which the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. At this price, each demander finds a matching supplier. No one walks away unable to get what they want, given the price of the good. The market clears. That's why we call it the market clearing price. There's no shortages. There's no surpluses. Everybody, given the price, everybody who wants something is able to purchase it. Everyone who wants to sell something is able to find a buyer. And you can see why, and we'll talk more detail about exactly why, but you can see why this is a good thing, right? Nobody's walking away frustrated. Everyone is able to get the things that they want. What you need to know is that equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the supply and demand curves, right? The equilibrium price and quantity, that is the price of the good and the quantity of the good bought and sold at that equilibrium where those curves cross, are the only ones that are stable in a free market. At any other point, economic forces push prices and quantities back toward equilibrium. So if we have a situation where we're not at equilibrium, free markets will push the price back and quantity back towards equilibrium. Put it another way, if markets aren't clearing, there are forces inherent in the marketplace that will drive that market towards the market clearing price and quantity. So we can look at this by sort of exploring what happens when prices are above the equilibrium price and then when prices are below the equilibrium price. So when prices are above the equilibrium price, we get a surplus, right? And you can see from the textbook and from the PowerPoint, right, that in that situation where prices are above the equilibrium, the quantity supplied is going to be greater than the quantity demanded. Right? Price will be the price line, right, will be above the intersection of supply and demand. And if we read that off, we see that at that price, right, not surprisingly, sellers at that price are very willing to offer more for sale at that nice high price. But at that nice high price, demanders are reluctant, right? There are some folks for whom that price is too high and they're unwilling to pay it to purchase whatever the good might be. So the question is, given that surplus, given that excess of quantity supplied over quantity demanded, what happens? Well, if we think about it sort of intuitively for a moment, it should be pretty obvious, right? You have all these sellers who are trying to sell this product and can't. And say, we think about the farmer's market and someone bringing apples to the farmer's market. They set their price above the equilibrium. People don't want to buy apples at that price, or not very many anyway. All the apples they brought with them are sitting there going unsold. What do? Eventually, you decide to cut your price, right? And in particular, what you'll begin to see is competition among the sellers to cut their price to pull in buyers. And so seeing that surplus, seeing those apples going unsold, sellers will start to lower their price. As they lower their price, two things will happen. One, more demanders will come back into the market. At the lower price, some of the people who were unwilling to purchase at the previous higher price now are willing to purchase. They'll come in and they'll buy apples. And at the same time, some of the apple sellers will pull some of their apples away, right? Because you're not, given the now falling price, you won't be willing to sell as many apples as you would before, right? And so we see a shrinkage in the quantity supplied, an increase in the quantity demanded, and we see that price heading down towards the market clearing the equilibrium price. And of course, that price will continue to fall until it hits that market clearing price, right? The competition among those sellers, among the suppliers, will drive that price back towards equilibrium. Okay, so whenever we see a price temporarily stuck above equilibrium, we're going to get a surplus. And that surplus will resolve itself by sellers competing with each other to drop the price. Conversely, if we start out with a price below market clearing, that is below equilibrium, we get a shortage, right? Again, you can imagine looking at a supply and demand graph, and if you have the PowerPoint in front of you, you can look at slide 15 from chapter 4, and there you can see, right, with a price below equilibrium, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, and that's what we call a shortage. There are more people who wish to buy the good at that price than there are quantities available from the sellers at that price. And so what happens, right? Well, buyers are now going away frustrated, right? Buyers are thinking, well, I can't get the good that I want at that price. And some number of buyers will be unable to. And that's the shortage, right? That they simply can't obtain the good they want at the current market price. So what happens? Well, just the reverse. We now get competition among the buyers. You can imagine, again, sort of our Apple story, right? Where this time the price is set super low and lots of people are lining up to buy apples, but the sellers only have a few available at that price because they're just not willing to part with more than that given that price. So what's going to happen? Well, what we can imagine, right? Someone in that line going, well, wait a second. If let's suppose the price right now is a dollar a pound for apples, right? And the market clearing price would be $3 per pound. Person saying, well, $1 per pound, I can't get my apples. I'll pay you $1.25 per pound, right? Someone else says, well, I'll pay you $1.50 per pound. And that competition, this time among the buyers, begins to drive the price up. Well, what happens is the price starts to be driven up? Two things. Same two things, mirror image. On the one hand, some buyers were now going to walk away from that apple stand, right? They were willing to pay $1 a pound for apples, but they're not willing to pay more than that. Or when the price goes up to $1.50, they're not willing to pay more than $1.50. They'll start to walk away. But at the same time as the price begins to go up, some of those apple sellers are going to pull their trays of apples out from behind or in the truck or wherever they are and start offering them for sale at that higher price. So we see as the price goes up, the quantity demanded begins to fall from where it was before, right? As some of the buyers are leave the market as the price begins to rise, but the quantity supplied starts to go up, right? As the higher price attracts in more apples, right? As suppliers begin to offer more for sale at the steadily increasing price. And again, that price is going to keep going up until when? Until it reaches the equilibrium, the market clearing price. At that point, nobody's dissatisfied anymore. There's no shortage. There's no surplus. Nobody's walking away unhappy. And this process that we've just been describing is really the key to how markets operate, right? That in a free market, supply and demand work this way and drive the market back towards that market clearing, that equilibrium price. Markets are, again, if you think back to the chapter 1, right, this is our order without design, right? Nobody's forcing people to do this. This is all built into the very process of the market itself. And again, with the right institutions, the right rules of the game, and the incentives are right, and the signals sent by prices are right, people will respond in these ways, and markets will tend to clear. Now, obviously, in the real world, right, there's always constant change taking place, right? This sort of hypothetical stories that we've been telling, our Apple story, assume, right, everything else is locked up in the box before, like before, right? And so all that's really changing here is price. But if people's income changes or their preferences change, right, all of that will mess this up. But when we tell this story of market adjustment, we tell it by assuming all else is equal, all else is held constant, right? And if we allow those other things to come out of the box, right, we get a more complicated story, okay? So why is it good that markets end up at that market clearing, at that equilibrium price? And the answer to that question is at the market clearing price, at the equilibrium price, the gains from exchange are maximized. To go back to our terminology from the previous chapter, the sum of consumer and producer surplus is maximized at the equilibrium price. As the book points out, right, a free market maximizes the gains from trade. Available goods are bought by buyers with the highest willingness to buy and sold by sellers with the lowest cost. Between buyers and sellers, there are no unexploited gains from trade, no wasteful trades. Everybody gets what they want, okay? And those three conditions imply that the gains from trade have been maximized. And you can see that, again, graphically on the slides from 21 through 23 in the PowerPoint. The key point I want to make is that at any quantity that trades that's less than the equilibrium, the market clearing quantity, that is anything to the left of the market clearing quantity, right, we see unexploited gains from trade. That is, if that quantity could be higher, right, there are the possibility of trade is there. There are people who would pay a price such that pay a price greater right, than the price at which suppliers would be willing to offer the good for sale. But for some reason, something's blocking them from doing that, right? We can think about our shortage and surplus story. Eventually, they resolve themselves. But if we're stuck to the left of that market clearing in terms of quantity, if we could just move it to the right, there are people who are willing to supply the good at a low enough cost, and people who are willing to pay a high enough price that there are gains from exchange to be had there. But for some reason, they're not happening. And only when we get to the equilibrium price and quantity combination are those gains maximized. If we go beyond that, we are not. It's not sort of lost opportunities as actual wasted resources. If we move to the right of market clearing, then we have people trading things that are of more sort of suppliers are offering things for sale at a cost that's greater than the price that people are willing to pay, if that makes sense. And somehow we'll talk about some examples of how that could be, but we're overproducing the good, right, in that situation where the costs of producing it are greater than the value it has to the people who are buying it. That's wasted resources. So to the left of market clearing, unexploited gains from trade. To the right, wasted resources. Only in the middle, only right at market clearing, do we maximize the gains, the gains from exchange. That is, we maximize the sum of consumer and producer surplus. Okay. So the other thing I want to make sure that we understand in this chapter is the movement of those of supply and demand curves. Right. We talked a little bit about this in the last chapter. I want to talk some more about it here, and I think sort of the best place to go to see this are the last set of slides in the chapter. So if we go, for example, to 33, let me back up a little bit actually. If we go to 28, okay, there's a good example of what we're talking about. So here's a case where we say have an increase in the supply of the good. Again, you can think about apples suddenly that say Apple sellers bring more to the marketplace. And for at least in the short run, right, we're going to have a surplus. The price of the good presumably hasn't adjusted yet. The shift in supply means at that old price, let's say yesterday at the farmer's market, right? At that old price, people were willing to supply a certain amount. Now the shift in supply means at that price, they're willing to supply more. So they bring more to the marketplace at that old price. But what happens in the sort of in the immediate run, in the short run, we have a surplus. Those extra apples are there, and at that price, people were only willing to buy what they were willing to buy yesterday, right? Assuming demand hasn't changed. So what's going to happen? We'll have the surplus, but then we get the adjustment process. We, as it were, sort of crawl down the demand curve as the price begins to fall, right? As suppliers compete with each other, we drive back towards that market clearing equilibrium price. And we can see that again in the series of slides 28, 29, and 30. Competition drives prices down, and then the new equilibrium, right, in slide 30 is at the lower price and lower quantity combination after all of this settles down. So one of the things we see here is an increase in supply lowers price and increases the quantity of the good being traded. But notice something else important here, right? When the supply curve moves to the right that way, it moves down along the existing demand curve. Notice the demand curve does not change. What happens here is when supply shifts to the right like that, when supply increases and drives down price, the lowering of price moves us along the demand curve. That is, it increases the quantity demanded. Notice there's no change in demand here. None of those 6 factors that can shift the demand curve have changed. Something's caused the supply curve to change. Perhaps it's cheaper to produce the good, right? But nothing's caused the demand curve to change. And so one of the things we have to remember here is that a shift in supply changes the price. That causes a change in quantity demanded. A change in the curve on one side changes price and changes the quantity supplied or demanded on the other side. We can go through the same exercise with demand. Suppose people decide again that apples cure some terrible disease. They come to the market the next day with an increase in demand for apples at the old price, right? People are lining up, there's a shortage, but eventually people begin to bid the price up. But when we think about those shifting curves, we see the demand curve shift to the right. It moves along the upward sloping supply curve as the price begins to climb up. Quantity supplied increases. Shift in demand, change in price, change in quantity supplied. One of the questions you might have had as we were sort of working through this, especially in the previous chapter, is, okay, so if what a demand curve is different amounts people are willing to purchase at various prices. What causes the price to change? Especially when we're thinking about this difference between a shift in a curve and a movement along the curve. What causes the price to change? Well, the answer to that question is what causes the price to change is a movement in the other curve. So when we talk about movements or changes in quantity demanded because the price has changed because supply has changed. And same thing on the other side, right? Why do suppliers respond to rising and falling prices? Take our example of the wheat and the soybeans, right? We said if the price of wheat goes up, people will shift from soybeans to wheat. Well, why did the price of wheat go up, right? Because presumably something was changing on the demand side for wheat. So that's a key point here, right? That when we think about these changes, right, we distinguish between changes in quantity demanded, which is a movement along the curve, a change only in price, and a change in demand, which happens when we let all that stuff out of the box, right? All those other things that we've held constant. But what causes the price to change? Again, a shift in the curve on the other side. So the reason the demand curve is so interesting to us is because we now have this function that describes different price and quantity combinations people will of the good people buy. That way we can know if supply shifts and therefore the price changes, how will quantity demanded change? How much more or less will people buy? And so that distinction between demand and quantity demanded is really important. There's another video, one of the supplemental videos in this chapter that explores this in more detail, and I strongly recommend that you take a look at it so you understand the difference between those two. The PowerPoint has some things on it, and that's helpful, but that particular video I think is more helpful than just looking at the PowerPoint. So again, key point here, this is the most fundamental mechanism in how economists understand the market economy. The idea that equilibrium, market clearing, is where the gains from exchange are maximized, and that free markets have a tendency to drive towards that equilibrium, that market clearing price and quantity combination. When prices are out or away from equilibrium or away from market clearing, we see in the case where prices are above market clearing, we see suppliers competing with other suppliers. In the case where it's below, demanders competing with other demanders. One last point. Notice, suppliers compete with suppliers. Demanders compete with demanders. Demanders don't compete with suppliers. Demanders and suppliers cooperate with each other. They're trying to find that market clearing. The competition takes place among the suppliers on one side and among the demanders on the other. So that's it for Chapter 4.